want to invite you this morning to join me in Exodus chapter 2. Again, this morning is a very serious subject that we're going to be looking at. The Sanctity of Life Sunday is something that is recognized around Southern Baptist life. And in Exodus chapter 1, I want us to begin looking at the issue. Tonight we're going to continue looking at it. As we look at the life of Moses, we look at the prenatal life of Moses, and then tonight we'll look at the early days of Moses, the early years. But this morning I want us to look at his life, starting in verse 15 of chapter 1, the life and the events that were happening before he actually came into the world, and how God sovereignly watched over those things, and how God chose people in his life that would give him life, how God showed his own heart about issues that we have to deal with today in our society. Starting in verse 15, it says, "Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when you do the duties of the midwife of the Hebrew women, and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. And so it was that because the midwives feared God, that he provided households for them. So Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive." A passage like that brings us face to face with America in the last quarter of the 20th century. In Psalms 106, I'd like to read to you starting in verse 35. It says, "But they mingled with the Gentiles and learned their ways. They served their idols, which became a snare to them. They even sacrificed their sons and their daughters, and shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and their daughters, and the land was polluted with the blood." We look across America today, and we have to ask some very tough questions. There's an issue out there that's been there almost all of my life. I was a child of the 60s and a teenager in the 70s, and this issue really came to life and came to the full effect as my life moved into the teenage years and got older and older. This issue began to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And still today, it's an issue that divides our country. The issue of pro-life, pro-choice, all these names that are thrown around. What does it really mean? And what is the significance for us as the people of God? What is our choice to be? How do we keep in line with Scripture when an issue like this, that is such a strong emotional issue, continues to exist in our land today? There's a movie out at the present time. It's an animated feature called The Prince of Egypt. And again, it is an animated adaptation of the life of Moses. The life that almost wasn't. Because in Moses' time, there was a movement to get rid of life that was threatening, life that was unnecessary in the king's eyes, and to try to push it aside, assuming that God did not have a greater purpose for it. The prince that almost was not. Some years ago, I saw a television interview of a young lady. This young lady was about 20 years old. She was horribly scarred. The way that she got scarred was when she was inside her mother's womb, an abortionist attempted to end her life. Attempted to do it by sending into that womb a solution which would burn her. She would inhale it, and it would burn her on the inside as well, causing death. But miraculously, she survived it. And she walks around today as a living testimony of someone who survived this atrocity that takes life after life after life in our country today. Today, you will be fined $5,000 and get up to 1 year in jail for crushing the egg of an eagle. And yet surrounding us or the events, the activities, that in comparison to that are amazingly heavy on the heart of God. And you may say this morning that I disagree with abortion, but I don't want to hear about it. I choose to avoid the debate and just live out my life. Just let that issue stay separate from me. I will not give money to it. I won't support it, but I just don't want to think about it. Well, that was the attitude that our country had. In 1860, we finally had to deal with the issue of slavery, and our country was at war with one another. It took us till 1941 to finally deal with the atrocities that had been going on for years in Germany, when we were almost forced into a war, that we finally had to go and deal with these death camps that were systematically destroying the Jewish people. And now history has dealt us, this generation, an issue by which we will eventually be judged by. You may ask somebody today, Grandpa, what were you doing in the 30s and the 40s? When Hitler was out there, when Hitler was doing his best to destroy so many lives, what was your reaction? What was your attitude? And someday we may have to answer the same questions. Grandpa, Grandma, when this was going on year after year in America, how did you respond? There was a TV show a few years ago called Civil War in America. And on this show, they had brought people from the pro-life and pro-choice. And they were to debate this issue, and they called it a civil war. And when one of the people on the pro-life side got a chance to speak, he spoke directly at the journalists who were quote-unquote kind of monitoring this and running the show. And he says, you call this a war. You call it the Civil War in America. Why don't you cover it like a war? Why don't you go into the trenches like with the Vietnam War? Why don't you show the bodies? Why don't you show the blood and the gore? Why don't you show it like a war? And when you look at this issue as you would a war and take a journalistic view of it, you begin to count the bodies like we would have counted the Americans that died in Vietnam. And you find out that every year there are 4,000 more casualties. You find out that since 1973 there have almost been 40 million casualties in this war. One every 21 seconds in America. 1.5 million will be missing from this year's graduation class, both in high school and also in college. And millions are missing from the workforce. Those who would go out into the workforce and provide Social Security and other benefits for those who have grown older in America. They're not there. They are missing because we made a decision that their life was not essential for our world. God did not make that decision. We made that decision as a country. In the Vietnam War, you had the war zones that they would go into. You'd see pictures from that war zone. The war zones in this war are buffered off. You cannot step within so many feet of where the atrocities go on. The weapons of war makes me think of May Day, when the Russian army would go down on their way to Red Square, and they'd have these great big tanks, and they'd have all these soldiers just marching uniformly. A display of the great power and the weapons that they had. If they ever had to use them, if anybody ever threatened them, this is the muscle and the might that they would use. Well, the weapons of this war are very secret, are not seen. There are weapons such as drugs that are injected and cause the womb to violently react. And in that violent reaction, that baby in there, almost like in an earthquake, is killed by the action of the womb. Weapons like scalpels that actually take the baby apart, so much that a nurse has to put every piece back together to make sure none is still left inside so an infection doesn't occur. Weapons like solutions that go in and burn inside and out. And weapons like sharp instruments that a baby, even full term, is brought halfway out and the brain is penetrated before it's fully out and still legal to take that life at that point in America. In Exodus chapter 1:15, it says, the king of Egypt, who was worried about an increasing number of Hebrews, Their numbers were getting greater and greater, and he was scared that if another nation came to his borders and threatened to attack him, that the Hebrews would go with that nation, and the numbers would be insurmountable for him, and he would be defeated as a nation. And God was blessing the Hebrews. They were getting more and more in numbers. And Pharaoh had a problem. And his solution to that problem was to kill the male children, to kill the next generation of male children of the Hebrew people. And so he didn't have the technology for prenatal, so he started postnatal abortion. As soon as that child is born, if it's a boy, kill it. If it's a girl, let it live. Back in the time of Pharaoh, a nation's strength was seen by the young men that nation possessed. The more young men you had, the more muscle. We count missiles today, but they counted young men. In China today, where they're only given the right to have one child, you'll find that there are more young men that are allowed to live, where a young girl will be aborted, but a young man will be allowed to live because they want to capture that heritage for the family, continue the family name. And so they've got this disparity between men and women in that generation. Pharaoh was worried. He didn't know what to do, and his solution was to kill the children. In the 60s, we had the sexual revolution in America. The sexual revolution brought promiscuity, unwanted pregnancies. It brought a fear of population explosion. And America's solution in 1973 with Roe versus Wade was abortion. It wasn't turning back to God. It wasn't changing how we lived as a people. It was to try to get rid of the residue so we could keep going the same direction morally. That was our solution. Pharaoh established clinics all across Goshen. And in America in 1999, starting in 1973, we have them almost in every town. Some towns, it seems like they got them on every street corner somehow or another, between a hospital and a Planned Parenthood. We've responded the same way as they have. There's a doctor named Dr. Bernard Nathanson. He was one of the proponents of the pro-choice movement back in those days, and he was one of the ones who testified before Congress, brought statistics before Congress, helped make reports. He has changed to the other side. And he has said, because one of the arguments back then was that if we don't legalize this, we've got women that are dying in these illegal abortions. They're unclean, they're back alley abortions, and they're dying left and right. And he brought up a figure of 10,000 women who are dying because of those atrocities of back alley abortions. And now he says about that number, we just made it up. We just made it up. He said if you don't have the morals not to kill thousands of children, a convenient lie is no problem at all. Just made the number up to win the debate. Pharaoh committed, again, abortion in reverse. He had the boys killed, while today we find that mostly, even though the women's movement promotes abortion, yet women suffer more from abortion, as more young girls are killed instead of young men. Now, in verse 17, it says that Pharaoh had a problem. His problem was that the midwives feared God. Two things the midwives knew. Number one, they knew that God was God, and they feared God. They feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. Even though Pharaoh was commanding them to kill the boys, they feared God. They feared God, and second, they knew that the children were children. The midwives were not pro-choice. Our own president ran into this problem when he executive ordered abortions to be done in army hospitals in Europe. He hadn't counted on all the doctors not being pro-choice and not wanting to participate in this. He had to replace the doctors because the doctors would not become a part of what he wanted to export over there. No society is pro-choice. There is not a surprise. In fact, civilization itself is, the basis of it is the limitation of choice. I can't leave church today, and my geo won't go that fast, but if I wanted to, I could not go 120 miles an hour home. Screeching around every corner, running through stoplights, running through stop signs. There would be a guy who would track me down, pull me over, and make me pay a lot of money in order to limit my choice. I couldn't go home by county market, fill up a basket, and just wave to them as I walked right out the door with it. They wouldn't allow me to do that. They limit my choice, my freedom to do that. I couldn't wait for one of these trucks to come 100 miles an hour down through here and push somebody out in front of it. I couldn't go to the high school, walk the halls, and sell drugs. Our society limits that choice. I might want to do that. I wouldn't want to do that, but somebody might want to do those things. And our society says no. A pro-choice society would have no jails, it would have no prisons, it would have no courts, it would have no police. Do what you want to do. Make your choice and do it. We don't have that freedom. We limit choice. And what we limit choice about determines who we are as a people. The midwives were pro-life because they knew God was God and knew the children were children. Hundreds of women have been asked questions after they have left clinics, after they've either participated in an abortion or not. But all of them, every one of them, said that when they were in that clinic, they were never told that what was inside them was a baby. They said they were told that it was an embryo, a fetus, or a product of conception, but never that it was a human life. And that word fetus is a very interesting word. You hear it constantly in this debate. Fetus is a Latin word. And it is Latin for unborn baby. It literally means unborn baby. It's amazing to me that Martin Luther worked so hard to translate the Bible from Latin to German. And we have so many translations ourselves from Latin, from Hebrew, from Greek to English because we want to know the truth. We want to see it and read it for ourselves. And yet now, in 1990, we're going back to the Latin to hide the truth, to keep us from facing the truth. Instead of calling it what it is, we go back to words that don't confront us. 60 physicians in Cambridge, Massachusetts met together, and they made a declaration. They said the biological facts that the fetus is a living human being is conclusive. It is not subhuman, but is alive, human, and unique in the special environmental support required for that stage of development. The number one argument that has been used in my lifetime has been that it's not a baby. Well, in 1973, maybe you could say something like that, and you couldn't really have a lot of proofs against it. But in 1999, we can send cameras inside there. We can see all the activity that goes on inside of a woman when she's carrying a baby. We can see the fingers. We can count the toes. We can see all the activity of every part of that child's body. The technology today has hopefully eradicated any intellectual attempt to try to use that argument that it is not a human life, that it is not a baby. But the second argument is still being used. Maybe it's a baby, maybe it's a human life, but it has no rights. It has no rights as a person. It has no personhood. The fetus has no personhood. In 1857, the Dred Scott decision said, the black man is not a person. That is why we can enslave them. In Hitler's Germany, they had a law that said the Jew is not a person. Maybe it's human life, but it has no rights as a person. See, Hitler understood that if you are going to destroy human life, you've got to dehumanize that person, that life. There were no handicapped spaces in Hitler's Germany because Hitler didn't just kill 6 million Jews. He also killed 275,000 handicapped people. He even got down to killing bedwetters, trying to eradicate anything that would be of his perfect Aryan race that he was trying to develop in the world. In the Bible, you'll find that there are over 100 texts that deal with the unborn. You'll find in Psalms 139 a text, and also in Jeremiah chapter chapter 1, verse 5. Jeremiah says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I sanctified you and ordained you as a prophet." Talking about Jeremiah and saying, while you were in the womb, I sanctified you. I ordained you. You were not just a product of conception, but you were a person I ordained, a prophet. And I set you apart, sanctified you right there at that time in your existence. When Mary came to see Elizabeth, both of them were carrying a baby. John the Baptist, who was 6 months older, when he got in the presence of Mary and Jesus, who was inside of her, the Bible says he leapt in the presence of Jesus. Well, both of them were still in the womb. In fact, the word that is used to describe John the Baptist in the womb is the same exact word that is used to describe Jesus in the manger. There was no differentiating at all between the two words. When God looked down at those two lives, he gave them the same definition. Here and out there, he called them a child. The same exact Greek word. Well, the king of Egypt did not like what the midwives did. He did not like their conclusion, and so he reacted to that. It says in verse 18 that he called for the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this thing? And let the boys live." And the midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they're vigorous. They give birth before the midwife can get to them." Now there's an amazing statement here. Pharaoh cannot believe that they would not obey the law of the land. It boggled his mind that he made a law and somehow they got a moral reason not to obey it. He didn't understand that at all. Why have you done this thing? Now, there are modern pharaohs today who have gotten the leverage legally to enact certain laws in our country, and they just cannot understand why people won't obey, support the law of the land. You hear that argument over and over. Well, you may not agree with it, but it is the law. It is the law of our land. So you're just going to have to deal with it. But that's the same thing that the Pharaoh could have said to the midwives. But the midwives dared to refuse to obey that law. They would not be participants in taking human life. There are laws out there today that were designed for drug dealers, called RICO laws. And those who have enough control, because those laws carry a big penalty with them, have been able to divert those laws over to be applied to trespassing at abortion clinics. So they can up the ante and bring a higher cost to somebody's commitment. There's an amazing action here by the midwives. And this may shock you, but the midwives lied. They actually lied. They were given a choice between murder and lying, hiding the truth about saving lives. And they lied. You find in the book of Joshua, the two spies were hidden by a prostitute of Jericho. When the authorities came looking for them while she hid them under the flax on the roof, she didn't tell them where they were. If somebody came to my house, if our nation changed a certain way and they wanted my children, where are they? I'd say they're on the moon for all I know. I don't care if I knew where every one of them was. I think I would lie to save life. If you would have gone to Corrie ten Boone's house in the 30s when she was hiding Jews behind walls, and the Nazis would have come and said, "Do you have any Jews here? Any Jews hiding in your house?" This godly woman would have said, "Haven't seen a Jew in a week." We are in a war, a horrible war for life in our country. And all these ethical traps that people try to throw at you, we need to really look at the picture from God's vantage point. That there is a cost of life that continues to go on in America today. A person like Daniel is told, the law of the land says you shall not pray. And Daniel, first thing he does is pray. The law of the land, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, says that you shall bow every time you hear that music and see that idol. And they stood proudly and tall. It's an amazing Amazing action, the reaction of the midwives. How did God react to somebody who did something like that? Verse 20 says, God was good to the midwives. The people multiplied, became very mighty, and because the midwives feared God, and God established households for them. God blessed them for being willing to take a stand at the cost of their own personal life. God blessed them because they were willing to stand up to that cost and to see that God would bless them in a greater way. I think Moses learned that same lesson. Hebrews says that Moses counted it loss, anything that he could gain from being the prince of Egypt, rather chose a reproach of the people of God. And he learned that thing before he was even born, by watching the midwives, watching his parents, and the way that they reacted to what Pharaoh was doing in the land. Well, Pharaoh's response was different. In verse 22, we see that Pharaoh commanded not just the midwives anymore, but Pharaoh commanded all the people. Everybody in the land now gets to be a part of this activity. He commanded everybody, if you find any of these Hebrew boys, throw them in the Nile. Give them to the crocodiles. Give them to the Nile to just engulf them. The Egyptians worshipped the Nile. They thought of it as a god. So why not just sacrifice his life to your God? He encouraged them to do it. You know, why not in America today participate in this? It'll give you more freedom. It'll allow you to live your life the way you want to live. It'll allow you to be on the throne of your life. We got our own idols. We got our own gods that we're sacrificing to. Well, there was one family that didn't want to be a part of that. You know, in America today, government-funded abortions allows every taxpayer to be a part of it. RU-46 allows it to come to every household, but there were some families who would not be a part of it in Egypt. And one family, thank goodness, was the family that God brought the deliverer into, that Moses was born into. Years ago, there was a woman who already had 3 children. This woman was already past 30 years of age. This woman had lost one of her kidneys. It was not as safe for her as others to have a child. Didn't plan on having any more kids. All of a sudden the doctor said, well, that's the reason you're not feeling the same. An unexpected, unplanned child. A moment of decision. The times are different. This was 1957. But I guarantee that woman was different too. That woman was my mom. And knowing my mom, and I was number 4. I was the accident in our family. My mom would have given me that other kidney if necessary. 1 in 4 don't make it into this country. 1 in 4 are gone to abortion in America today. Romans chapter 1, verse 31 describes a nation on its last leg. It describes a nation that is so far away from God that it can't get any worse. And some of the descriptions that we find there is that the people will be without understanding. They will be covenant breakers. They will be without natural affection. Esotorgus is the word there. Without natural affection. What it literally means, without family love. That maternal sense that is so strong will be diminished as a people grow farther and farther away from God. We find ourselves in our generation doing things for selfish reasons that our generations before us in this country would have never imagined doing. What a blessing it is when God gives us that strong sense of family, that devotion, that recognition that children are a blessing of the Lord. that children make us strong as a people. That children are the closest thing to the kingdom of heaven. I'm going to ask if you would about